The next structures we're going to cover are actually structures that don't seem to be shown surrounding the brain in your lab book. However, they are shown surrounding the spinal cord. So I want to start off by saying, well, okay, very quickly, here's the brain extending downward from the base of the brain, basically, is the spinal cord. Here it is. There's the spinal cord. The entire structure, brain and spinal cord, are surrounded by meninges. Meninges are protective sheaths that help to keep things in place and also protect them. And there are fluids sandwiched between them, for example. And there's 3 layers, and they're shown here in this picture: dura mater, arachnoid matter, and pia mater. So the dura mater means durable material. And it's real thick. It's as you can see here, I don't know if you can see it very well, but there's just that kind of light blue layer right there. It would be very, very thick if you were able to actually see a version of this. The arachnoid matter is a layer that usually contains blood vessels, or is sort of a protective place for blood vessels to sort of branch along the outside of these structures, and therefore it kind of looks spider webby. Therefore it's named for spider-like material, so arachnoid matter. And you can see in this picture it's depicted in white. The pia mater, or delicate material, would cling directly to the spinal cord. Now, again, I'm just trying to emphasize this point. These 3 layers protect the spinal cord, and they also protect the entirety of the brain. It's just not shown in these pictures to do so. So these meninges then are quite important. We talk about the types of fluid that are present in these structures and whether we can utilize them, for example, for surgeries. If you've ever heard of an epidural, it is where we try to take an anesthetic and inject it in such a way that it anesthetizes a portion of the spinal cord, for example. So epidural outside of the dura mater. So dura mater, arachnoid matter, and then the pia mater clinging directly to the spinal cord and directly to the brain. Now, you can see when we take a look at the spinal cord itself, this is a cross-section of the spinal cord, and there are a number of different structures that we want you to know. But in order to orient you to these structures, I want to point out that there is a dorsal or posterior side to this. And then there is a ventral or anterior side to this. And the way that we differentiate them is that the dorsal side, or the posterior side, is going to be carrying chiefly information about sensation. And as you can see, so this, what we're looking at here, would be a spine or a spinous process. And so this should orient you. Remember that the spinous processes kind of stick out at you when you're looking at a spine, at a vertebral column. So if you kind of follow the logic, then make your way into the spinal column, and this is going to be the posterior section, the posterior side of the spinal cord. And it's associated with this puppy here. This is called the dorsal root ganglion. So if you look carefully, you'll be able to see that there is a ventral root here and a dorsal root here. And these are extensions into and out of the spinal cord. The dorsal root ganglion would be bringing information about sensation into the dorsum of the spinal cord, or the posterior side of the spinal cord. And that brings information about sensation up into the brain. Therefore, it is called the ascending pathway into the brain. Conversely, we have the ventral side here, or the anterior side here. And you can see there's a posterior, lateral, and anterior horn. So this anterior structure, this anterior part, or this ventral part of the spinal cord, is going to be associated with motor information. It's some information about moving parts of the brain. It's sent from the brain. Therefore, this is considered the descending pathways of the spinal cord. And then you bring information out from here to the ventral root, and then it's sent eventually out into the rest of the body. So the dorsal root ganglion, when I look at the spinal cord kind of isolated on its own and you don't have a way to isolate, when you don't have a way to orient yourself to it better, I always use the dorsal root ganglion as a starting point because you can always find it. It's sometimes subtle, but it's always there. There's a dorsal root ganglion which kind of bulges out. It is on the dorsal side. It's associated with sensation or the ascending pathway, and it is eventually connected to the posterior portion of the spinal cord. In the center of the spinal cord, we have a central canal. We also have a posterior median sulcus here, which, remember, a sulcus is a small dip into something. We also have an anterior median fissure. Remember, a fissure is also a dip into something, so we have these little dips inward, or these grooves in the spinal cord, which are distinctive. Now, so we were just looking at a cross-section of the spinal cord, but this would be a longitudinal look at the spinal cord. One of the things we'll notice here is that there are cervical spinal nerves, thoracic spinal nerves, and lumbar, sacral, and coccygeal segments of the spinal cord. There's a cervical enlargement and there's a lumbar enlargement of the spinal cord. And at the very bottom, there's what's called a horse's tail or a cauda equina, which is basically nerves that keep extending off from the bottom of the spinal cord. Technically, the spinal cord ends at the conus medullaris, but then you continue to have nerves that come off from there, and it kind of looks like a horse's tail. So it's called the cauda equina, which translates as horse's tail. Let's take a look at the nerves themselves, the spinal nerves. You may remember this, that we have these intervertebral foramina through which the spinal nerves extend outward into the body, or if you will, back from the body into the spinal cord. Remember, it's bringing information about movement out and sensation in. Remember that. That's important. I think sometimes it's misunderstood in that way. Every spinal nerve is going to be a both thing. It's going to be both carrying information about movement and information about sensation. There are 8 cervical spinal nerves. There are 12 thoracic spinal nerves, and there are 5 lumbar spinal nerves, and they are associated with the bones that surround them. You may recall that there's only 7 cervical vertebrae, but remember I said there are 8 cervical spinal nerves. So it turns out there's a spinal nerve above the first vertebrae, and so you actually start counting above that one. So if you were talking about cervical spinal nerves, you would say C1, C2, C3, C4, C5, C6, C7, C8. Then the 8 would actually be below the point of the C7 vertebra. So there's 8 cervical vertebrae, and then you just keep on counting down for the thoracic 1 through 12, T1 through 12 nerves, and then lumbar, L1 through L5 nerves. And so generally speaking, nerves are going to be, the thoracic and lumbar, the nerves are going to be underneath of the bones that are, underneath of the bones for which they are named, if you will. But cervical are going to be above.